various other things. He also apparently was confusing an office that Otto Reich had set up in the State Department called the Office of Public Diplomacy with USIA, even though Otto Reich had nothing to do with USIA. All these issues, and he quote closed the loopholes of Fulbright. But Zirinsky said the American taxpayer doesn't want to be propagandized by their own money, and Zirinsky's law amendment led a federal court to rule that USIA material was exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests, which helped solidify that USIA's public diplomacy is propaganda unfit for American people, right? You get into 99 and USIA goes away. USIA people are now in state, and they argue stridently that the Smith-Mundt firewall is the only thing protecting their ability to communicate with foreign audiences, because if you take away this firewall, State Department will only talk to Americans and not be engaging abroad. This is false. But then you have, after 9/11, you have the State Department failing to engage effectively audiences abroad. I kind of touched on some of this earlier. And so you have the Defense Department starting to take up. In fact, there's a Defense Department memo, a legal memo it's actually remarkably late. I think it was 2011. I would have thought it would have been earlier, but it was surprisingly late, that effectively said, hey, we're kind of doing the State Department job in this international information space, and that's covered by Smith-Mundt. So therefore, we must be covered by Smith-Mundt until Congress tells us otherwise, which is kind of absurd on its face, because the Defense Department activities are Title 10 and Title 50. And this Smith-Mundt is Title 22, Foreign Affairs. And it specifically names State Department, USIA, Broadcasting Board of Governors. At any part of the legislation, it reads as if it's 1948 to 1953 or 53 to 99 or post 99. It's never been properly cleaned up to reflect the present day. It never mentions any other agency but this. It's very specific. And yet DOD somehow thinks that this Title 22 legislation applies to them and their Title 10 or Title 50 activities, which is absurd in its face. And in fact, if you read any of these academic law review journal articles, they never resolve this issue. And so Thornberry passes the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012-2013, which I helped write and helped defend in the passage of it, which basically says, no, Defense Department, this does not apply to you. Stop pretending it does. And yet we still, because we misunderstand these things, because there's not a proper history, because we're so hung up on these Fulbrightian concept of the stuff is illegal propaganda, as opposed to methods, means, outcomes. And the fact that, why would we be lying to audiences, particularly those that smell propaganda much better than the American audience? Why would we be doing that? We get caught up, and so we use Smith-Mundt to say what we can't do, even if it doesn't apply whatsoever. They're trying to survive. But I can't, and again, this was post-dependent.
How does the Global Engagement Center come into this whole discussion? My understanding is that the Global Engagement Center is a relatively new creation that has something to say about all of this, surely, right?
Yeah, the way I would frame GEC, Global Engagement Center, is it is primarily a product of the failure of the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs to carry out the mission we collectively, quote, believe they should do. And let me unpack that. Most people don't think the Undersecretary should do that, and I think that's because they restrict their understanding of the Undersecretary's job to this narrow concept of public diplomacy. After all, the Undersecretary's title includes public diplomacy and public affairs. I argue, as well as colleagues and colleague and I, we've been trying to place an article on this, but nobody's wanted to take it up for weeks. That the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, Public Affairs is the State Department's chief international or global information operations officer. But for most of the history of this, in fact, the entire history of this position since 1999, so the past 22 years-ish, that's not what the position has been perceived as. And GEC is, in shorthand, I think you could say and should say, is that it was an attempt to recreate USIA, although a better model would be the International Information Administration within the State Department. And I say IIA because it was a quasi-independent agency within the State Department, whereas USIA was a separate federal agency. But the problem is that GEC has limited authorities, and I don't mean authorities as in who it can talk to. I mean, it doesn't actually have a lot of people. It doesn't actually have control over a lot of resources. Now, it has money to parcel out, but it's effectively a stopgap measure. And we forget that GEC was passed as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, actually as part, let me hold that thought. GEC was passed as an amendment to NDAA because there was a concern that GEC prior to that in 2016, starting in 2017, because GEC existed only through executive order, that GEC would cease to exist because the president with a swipe of a pen could eliminate GEC. And GEC's mission was expanded to include Russia through this amendment. Now, it's possibly relevant to your audience that this amendment by then Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Thornberry, was threatened with being blocked from the NDAA because the Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Royce, wanted his amendment to abolish the board of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. He threatened Thornberry, that Thornberry's amendment, which was affecting the State Department, which is Royce's area, his Foreign Affairs Committee, he would argue, Royce would say, this is not germane because this should be under my committee, not yours, if you don't allow my amendment to abolish the board into the NDAA. Thornberry said, sure, expecting it to be stripped out in the Senate side. And I won't get into reasons why it appears that that was not stripped out. Several people didn't act very well in that regard, is all I'll say. But so there's a relationship there, and this actually goes back to an earlier point that we didn't touch on as to why the Broadcasting Board of Governors got renamed to the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Well, because the board was abolished, so there's no more board, and so it became the Agency for Global Media. But there is this amendment to create GEC and make it permanent, because somebody might make it go away. But why does it exist in the first place? Why did it exist? Why did its predecessor, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication, CSCC, exist? Because of deficiency in the State Department. Ostensibly, all these capabilities were there with the Bureau of International Information Programs, which is the largest rump, if you take out the capital cost of international broadcasting, the largest rump of USIA, IIP, moved into state from USIA in 1999. And this had an incredible capability. And ostensibly, in fact, it for a long time had its own news operation. But it had a footprint, and it was directly integrated with the State Department, a huge mass global footprint, operating in more places than the named BBG entity did, because IIP was everywhere the State Department was, and then some. Whereas BBG had a specific target audience, right?
Right.
But this IIP thing was mismanaged terribly, horribly, marginalized, morale was shot. In fact, during the Obama administration, there was a coordinator for IIP, Jim Glassman, the last Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs under the Bush administration, was able to get this coordinator to be upgraded to assistant secretary. His successor did not use that assistant secretary seat because she did not want to put her choice for the heading IIP through the confirmation process, instead made a direct hire. I mention that because when the Office of OIG did their investigation into IIP, they had to extend the investigation because so many people in IIP had saved up so many materials and wanted to talk to OIG to complain about the leadership, that it took longer it was just horribly mismanaged, and nobody did anything about it. Wow. It was just a mess. And so there's no leadership and accountability. And so you have this trickling through all the way through. There's the SETimes.com. IIP didn't want to take on SETimes.com. Why? Well, because DoD wanted too much leadership. I had a conversation with the DoD people, actually at Phoenix Challenge. They won't take this on. IIP wouldn't talk to PA, Public Affairs. The Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, I was sitting down and meeting with him, who has a dotted line to the Assistant Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, although that's not a subordinate relationship because of the defects in thinking about global and non-US and US. And the IIP chief would not talk to the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. Why? Well, the IIP chief thought that PA wanted to take him over. There's no leadership. The stuff was just flowing around because nobody saw this stuff as important.
Yeah.
That's an ugly mess. And nobody gets into these things. They don't look at these issues. They just say, oh, this is the way it's working. Let me create this. Nobody attempts to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. They just, let's create a new box. Let's not understand why the defect is there.
Right. Wow. Well, as I mentioned at